What is conflict? By its very nature, we think of conflict as something like gunpowder, explosions, the ruins of buildings, but conflict is whenever two interests are at play and they're unable to be reconciled. Conflict has taken many forms throughout history, but time and time again, conflict comes to the same things over and over again. A process of adaptation. In order to win the conflict, you must have leverage and a superior means of having power. Power, by its very nature, is the sole decider of what does happen and what doesn't happen. Power is the decider of what lives in the future and what is relegated to the past. We see this in every dimension throughout human and history as a whole. From the very moment life appeared on this earth, it was adapting and competing to survive and reproduce. From the first archaeological records we see of man, we find pointed spears and skulls that have been caved in and stabbed. I will be exploring the philosophy of Niccolo Machiavelli, a Renaissance Italian philosopher and political writer who, almost for the first time in the history of his modern era, said the truth that everyone knew but some were unwilling to admit. That there is no victory of the righteous, there is victory of the powerful and those who adapt. It was Thucydides, the ancient Greek, who first said, "Might makes right." That is because he lived in an era where Greek states fought and were annihilated, not for any superior moral virtue or for any grand narrative, but simply because there were conflict over things like resources and pride. It was written by the ancient Greek Heraclitus that life itself was a river of war, a constant cycle of being refurbished and adapting, competing. Life was a perpetual state of birth and death, and within that, there was competition. These philosophers saw within their world virtue and morality, but saw something that many wanted to avert their eyes to, and it was that virtue and morality didn't mean a damn thing to what actually happened in the world. There were people like the papacy, who was supposed to be the greatest moral figure in Machiavelli's time, deciding the will of God for the Catholic Europe of the era. And he watched as the papacy had popes who got syphilis. Now, if you know how syphilis gets contracted, you'd realize popes really shouldn't have that. Moral figure, not really doing that all that often, at least not supposed to. And yet, he saw it happen, and he wondered, how did they get to be the supreme moral figure of his civilization? And he looked at their strategies. He looked at the strategies of every little prince, every little king, every emperor of history, and every despot and autocrat of the world. And he realized there is no divine right, no God deciding who kept power. It was merely those willing to take the most action to keep, defend, and take that power. It may seem obvious, but those people who actually change the world are not those who have a right to change it, or should be the ones changing it by any moral standards. They are the ones who do the most to change it. The ones who see that the people around you who you care about may one day become stones to pave the path to your power and victory. And if you do not choose to use those people and things you care about as stones to pave your path when the time comes, you will simply become a stone of someone else's path. Niccolo Machiavelli, Thucydides, Heraclitus, they all saw the truth of their time, and that was might makes right, that power is the sole decider. They knew that whatever virtue or moral they aspired to achieve, it meant nothing if they didn't have the power to enforce it. They knew that the world couldn't be a better place if those who truly had good intentions in their heart were unwilling to do the disgusting and heinous things that it took to get power. And for that reason, Machiavelli in that era was shunned. He dispelled the idea that kings were put in place for their virtue by God. He dispelled the idea that power was anything except violence. This is merely presenting you with the history and philosophy of violence. And I have no desire to influence any of your views on it beyond giving you better information. But when we look into the history and nature of violence, we find that it is entirely inseparable from every one of us. Matter of fact, who here is Floridian? Born here. 4 out of 6 of us are Floridian. Do you know the people who lived on this land 500 years ago? Do you even know so much as know their name? Any?
Whatever, guy who found the fountain. St. Augustine.
In St. Augustine, there's actually a cemetery with a group of individuals buried on it. They have peculiar names. Their tombstones don't actually have the names on them that they were born with. They're the Timucuan people, the original people who lived on this land before Europeans arrived. When Europeans arrived, the Timucuans were very quickly and successively annihilated. First by disease, which killed roughly 90% of them. Smallpox, measles, and the like. But then, raids came in Florida. And through, perhaps by 1800, every single Timucuan was dead. Their language was silent. These people who had lived on this land since before time itself was being recorded in books were annihilated so quickly that we can't even feel their presence today. Despite how entrenched they were, how much right they had to that land, with their ancestors likely living over 50 generations on that land, to the point where we can't even tell who lived on it before them, if there was anyone before them. They learned that the sole decider of who gets to do what is violence and power. And who came after them? We will know this name, the Seminole. We see that name everywhere. And that is because we as Americans conquered this land from the Seminole. The Seminole were not a people. That's a historiographic myth. They were a collection of peoples, all of which fleeing violence came to Florida because the geography made it inaccessible to European warfare. The people who later on became the Seminole actually murdered and enslaved the remnants of the Timucuan and replaced them. The Seminole came here because they learned that might makes right, and they thought that they would have the most might, making their final stand in Florida. And they did make their final stand. They won many battles against our ancestors, the Americans. And yet we are still on this land because it made no difference how many battles they won. We had more power. We took this state. And by 100 years ago, we had deported all of them to reservations. They make up no significant presence anywhere in Florida except the various casinos scattered about the state now. The Seminole have their own nation in Oklahoma, but we deported them there because we had the power to. Every one of us lives on this land because we could commit atrocities far better than those who originally kept it. We had no virtue, we had no right to this land by anything but conquest. To pretend like this isn't the case is to betray our very existence as a whole. We only get to exist because our ancestors committed horrific acts of violence. We all live off the fruits of the great sins of our ancestors. And do I present this to you as a bad thing? Absolutely not. Because this is the nature of mankind. This is the nature of life itself. Adaptation and power. So when you feel the sand under your feet, the dirt, you look at the buildings that we've established on this land, know that there was something before they were built. Something before that as well. And we destroyed it and bulldozed it so we could be here. There is no people of peace in this world because the pacifists of history are just that, of history. They were eventually annihilated by those willing to take decisive action.
Beautiful.
Remember, kids, tell your parents, we killed them all.
Yeah.